Before we get into the main substance, no matter where you're watching from, please leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe to the channel. Tonight, we begin with a turning point that leaders in Washington have long feared, consistently ignored, and never truly prepared themselves to face. A decision not dragged out through endless rounds of negotiations, but executed decisively in the span of a single day. One day that sent technology hubs across California into turmoil. One day that forced automakers in Michigan back to the drawing board. One day that could fundamentally reshape how goods are manufactured across the United States. What unfolded today in Ottawa crossed a line the White House could no longer tolerate, and once that line was breached, the reaction in Washington, D.C. was a volatile mix of anger, shock, and panic. Yet at its core, the issue is remarkably simple. Perhaps none of this matters anymore, because Canada has just closed the door to the United States on materials that America cannot produce on its own, cannot easily replace, and cannot sustain its economy without. These are critical raw resources, the invisible foundation behind every electric vehicle, every mobile device, every military aircraft, and every advanced semiconductor the United States hopes to build in the years ahead. And right now, Canada holds the key to that door. Over the past several months, clear signals had emerged, not through grand declarations or high-profile summits, but through quiet indicators suggesting that Ottawa was preparing for a major move. Canada showed restraint, yes, but it also acted with clarity and calculation. Every step followed a defined roadmap, tightly managed and carefully sequenced. What truly unsettled observers in Washington, D.C. over the past week, however, was the sudden disappearance of those signals. Analysts tracking Canada's decisions quickly noticed the shift. Joint meetings were postponed, private consultations with mining executives intensified, foreign investment review processes were accelerated, and the tone of Canadian officials began to change. Then everything went silent. And when Ottawa goes quiet like that, it is usually a sign that a major announcement is imminent. For decades, the relationship between Washington, D.C. and Ottawa has rested on a single core assumption: that Canada needs the United States more than the other way around. That belief offered comfort, it created an illusion of stability and normalcy, and that assumption has proven to be entirely wrong. While leaders in Washington remained preoccupied with China, negotiations with Europe, and internal battles over social issues, Canada was quietly consolidating its position. It was methodically redefining where its real strength lies. They reviewed the advantages already at hand, weighed each point of strength, and then waited for the right moment to act. And that moment is today. This morning, officials at Canada's Department of Natural Resources unveiled a new strategic resources framework, introducing export restrictions on 23 critical materials, resources that, for decades, had almost never been subject to controls of this kind. These are not tools used lightly. Canada deploys them only when it intends to send a serious message. That message could be a trade countermeasure, a strategic realignment, or even a signal that it is prepared to move away from long-standing partners. At this stage, analysts cannot yet say which of these scenarios applies, or whether it is in fact all of them at once. But one thing is certain: Canada is changing the way it plays the game, and when a partner long regarded as stable and predictable shifts course without warning, even slightly, Washington has no choice but to pay attention. This time, however, it is not a minor adjustment. It is a major turning point. The materials listed under the new framework include lithium, indispensable for every modern electric vehicle battery; cobalt, a critical input for aerospace and defense manufacturing; nickel, the backbone of high-strength alloys and energy storage; graphite, used in nuclear power generation and everyday electronics; and rare earth elements, without which no advanced semiconductor can function. Canada holds some of the world's largest reserves of these resources, and as of today, American companies can no longer access them as freely as they once did. The response from the White House this evening has been unmistakably loud. This was not a token reaction, nor was it merely political theater. It carried real weight. One official after another, in a series of press briefings, described Canada's move as firm, unexpected, and unlikely to be reversed in the near term. US leaders had relied on pressure tactics to force counterparts to back down. But pressure loses its power when the other side does not flinch. Canada has held its ground. In fact, many analysts argue that Ottawa's move today represents one of the most carefully calibrated decisions in the recent wave of trade actions. And this is what has been announced so far. Almost immediately after the announcement was made public, Canadian task forces moved to contact US-operated mines in Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia to inform them that their export permits were being placed under review. These were not routine annual checks. They were emergency national security reviews, procedures Canada activates only when it is considering restricting or even cutting off access to supply altogether. The leadership of the American companies was caught completely off guard. US trade associations rushed to respond, and policymakers in Washington were suddenly forced to confront a question they had avoided for years. If our closest partner decides it has had enough of being taken for granted, what do we do? This evening, sources in Ottawa indicate that Canada is preparing to redirect shipments of these strategic materials to partners in Europe, Japan, and South Korea, countries that have already signed long-term agreements. Canada moved swiftly, acting before Washington could organize a response. Commitments have already been secured with leadership in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. These agreements were almost certainly negotiated quietly over many months, but they were only revealed today. In short, Canada has struck directly at the most vulnerable point in the US supply chain with remarkable precision. The very system once assumed to guarantee America's supply security has now become a point of exposure, and that is why the White House reacted so sharply. Canada's move is not merely symbolic, it is entirely practical. It represents a strategic shift strong enough to inflict real damage on US manufacturing capacity if left unaddressed. Washington, upon recognizing this, responded impulsively. Not with careful planning, not with calculated steps, but with rushed threats. No compromise was proposed, no invitation to negotiate was extended. Instead, there was talk of higher tariffs, references to sanctions, and it is precisely that reaction that may have pushed Canada one step further away. This is where the situation becomes more troubling. Security sources now suggest that Canada's latest move was designed to test whether US trade decision-making remains stable after a series of erratic and unpredictable tariff actions. Ottawa wanted to see whether Washington would respond with a coherent strategy or with chaotic instinct. The answer became clear very quickly. The lack of consistency on the US side was unmistakable. Washington delivered a fragmented, disorganized, and internally contradictory response. So much so that even Canada's monitoring teams identified it immediately. Under normal circumstances, it is not easy to truly capture Ottawa's attention. But today, Washington managed to do exactly that, in the worst possible way. Experts speaking on background told news agencies that Canada's move reflects a deliberate decoupling, aimed at reducing reliance on a partner that has become increasingly unpredictable and no longer fully reliable. The word decoupling should have sent shockwaves through the US leadership, because it is the very language Washington itself has used when talking about reducing dependence on China. Now, its closest partner is applying the same logic to its relationship with the United States. Today, Canada demonstrated that it possesses not only the capacity but also the resolve to do so. The restrictions imposed by Ottawa were calibrated with exceptional care and timed with such precision that American companies had no opportunity to build stockpiles in advance. That timing alone reveals the seriousness of the preparation. It shows that Canada is not merely reacting defensively to US actions, it is moving one step ahead and proactively safeguarding its own interests. As updates rolled in throughout the day, more details about the scale of Canada's plan began to emerge. Companies in Quebec indicated that they would prioritize contracts with European partners, forcing US automakers to seek alternative sources. Meanwhile, energy firms in Alberta confirmed that they have already begun redirecting rare earth shipments to Asian markets, drawing on cargoes that had been prepared and packaged months earlier. According to sources, provincial authorities, acting on directives from Ottawa, have temporarily suspended a number of joint projects that US defense contractors rely on to manufacture aircraft components. This is no longer a matter of routine trade adjustments, nor is it simply a technical compensatory measure. This is a comprehensive strategic turning point. Canada is beginning to wield genuine leverage, precisely the kind of leverage Washington has struggled to apply effectively since the tariff wars began. With every new tariff imposed by the United States, Canada's response has grown firmer. For every warning issued from Washington, Ottawa has answered with concrete action. And each time the United States assumed Canada would eventually back down, reality proved otherwise. It is worth recalling that Washington once believed Canada would quietly absorb the tariffs. They assumed Ottawa would prioritize partnership over maintaining a hard line. They believed Prime Minister Carney would yield under pressure. But by tonight, it is clear that every one of those assumptions was wrong. Canada is increasing the pressure. Canada is pushing back. And Canada is no longer placing the concept of partnership above all else. It is rewriting the terms of that relationship. And this recalibration could reshape trade across the continent for generations to come. This is not a short-term confrontation. This is not a tactical bargaining move. It is a fundamental reassessment of the role and ally the United States has become. And through the steps taken today, it is clear that Ottawa is approaching this with a level of seriousness never seen before. What makes this moment especially dangerous and unpredictable is that Canada's move comes at a time when Trump is under intense pressure within the United States itself. Automakers are sounding the alarm over tariffs. Technology giants are worried about the lack of stable supply chains. Defense contractors are demanding firm guarantees on materials. Lawmakers aligned with him are focused primarily on gaining an advantage ahead of the election. Trump is juggling all of these pressures while still trying to project toughness toward a partner he has previously mocked in public. And when leaders are pushed into such a corner, their decisions tend to come from weakness rather than strength, from insecurity rather than control. The same dynamic applies in Ottawa. Prime Minister Carney is facing no less political pressure. Canadians strongly support standing up to Washington. Businesses see expanding opportunities in Europe and Asia. Provincial premiers are repeatedly pressing the federal government to take an even firmer line.